Thank you. First, thank you so much for staying, because look, as you see, as soon as you say the arts, dance, the numbers evaporate, because they somehow think how insignificant that is in the Palestinian struggle. Now let's go to something much more political or economic and focus on that. So you are very insightful, snaps to you, because you have seen the importance and you see the relevance of the arts in the boycott, and hopefully you'll feel that more as I go through this presentation. I'm an artist and a historian, hence the shirt, and that's not an easy thing to claim. From history, I write about histories, and I sort of see where we've come from the arts. I'm trying to look at where we're going to and how we can envisage new futures and different ways of being. So, as mentioned, I was in the occupied Palestinian territories for 8 years, and that's where I did a significant amount of my research. I'm now in New Zealand at the University of Auckland, but continue to have links in Palestine. I go back quite regularly. I'm now working with BSA University, helping establish a new performing arts degree there, which is going to help contribute to the way the arts is valued and understood and developed and extended within Palestine. In terms of political inequality, we're going to get onto the boycott in a second, but I think this sort of provides a good sort of framework for looking at the relevance of the arts to political events. It can be seen that in the context in which performances take place, make them political. The themes that are presented within the work make them political. The identities of the performers and the financial supporters that made the event possible. Now, these are four quite important themes, because as we see, as I'm going to go through the history of arts boycotts in the occupied Palestinian territories, these become very contested theories and ideas. And it's been swinging between. Yesterday we had some comments about the boycott of Wonder Woman because of the lead actress, not because the work itself is in any way politically positioned. Perhaps the money is coming from Israel, I don't know, but it's certainly not an advocacy of that, but because of the identity of the performer and elements off screen. Then we have other examples that were presented yesterday in terms of events on campus, in which they're very much about the economics and the finances and where the funds are coming from. But I just want to keep those four theories in mind as we go through. First, though, I talk about Palestine all over the world, and so arts at campuses and students in the performing arts all over the place. And usually it's quite a contested place, so I've got this really quick, snappy way of making sure everybody agrees, so that no matter what I say, it's all coherent, which of course is impossible. And the first thing I try to go through is to identify the contested nature of the place. I won't do that now, because I think everyone in the room here has quite an understanding of that contested nature and its background. I would just identify this map, though, because I love using it. I love using it for three reasons. It's wonderful because it immediately flips people's perspective on how they see the region. They have to tilt their head sideways if they want to be able to keep thinking of Palestine in the way they've always thought, or Israel in the way they've always thought of it. And I was just up in Sweden. They're really, diminished by this. They're used to being at the top of the world, but this shakes the whole Mercator map up and makes us have to consider it in another format. Part of it's from my own insecurity of working in New Zealand, and my children always saying, "Why did you bring us to the end of the earth?" And just like a little comma there at the end of the unfinished sentence, it is Australia. But it seems poor, but this somehow puts New Zealand somewhere else. That's the first reason. I like to flip that. But if you do find it a bit disorienting, then just keep your head tilted like this throughout the whole session, and it'll make a lot more sense. Second reason is this is a great map. It's a 16th century map, and it reinforces for how many centuries Europe has perceived the region in terms of a biblical lens. All of these you will see are built on biblical place names, and the deep histories that go back, and the deep cultural expectations that go back of why, when we see Samaria, when we see Judea, where we see all of these Jewish titles and titles dating back to preceding kingdoms, it has been reinforcing and redetermining that region. And I ask audiences just to reimagine all of the other place names that might be there, for all of the other histories that have gone through, noting that Palestine is one of the most promiscuous regions in the world. Pretty much every culture has slept a night there and passed through, and it's a very multicultural, diverse society. As soon as you live in it, you see that diversity. And so it can't possibly be that these are the only names of places. The third reason I really like this map is it's got some really great names. Like, this one down here, the Valley of Lust. And I was just saying, I wish we had a Valley of Lust in New Zealand. We don't have one, not that I've been able to find. I don't know if you've got one here in Australia. And it's great because, you see this and you realize, oh wow, there's these histories to places. I used to go through the Valley of Lust with my wife for many years, early years in our marriage, when we were going out to refugee camps, doing arts activities. Almost on a daily basis, we went through the Valley of Lust. I still want to go back there. Yeah, it brings alive and gives a sense, look, there's lots of stories, lots of people have very different perspectives and different ideas on this place. So why does dance matter? Why are we going to look at it from that? What's that got to do with boycotts, and what's that got to do with where we might be going as a movement of as the BDS? Well, one is to note the significance and the extensive tradition of dance and how far it goes back. The earliest tablets we've got there from a couple of thousand years ago, a Canaanite village that had this dancing figure that's now on display in an Israeli museum and presents itself as an Israeli iconoclast, was from a Canaanite village of Laish about 2,000 years ago. This is in the pre-Mandite date period in the late 19th century. Wadi Musa rituals and performances. And going back and digging into these archives and histories and stories, many of which are really only captured by European explorers, is the only documentation we have of early European, sorry, I shouldn't say explorers, tourists, who were going through in the 19th century. But they did capture and tell stories about figures like female sword dancers, which have been written out of Palestinian nationalist histories of dance as they become masculinized and such. And so the importance of resurrecting and bringing these out and saying, actually, no, if we're going to fetishize the past or have this, as Ghassan was mentioning this morning, this very nostalgic remembrance, let's actually get the facts and see how complex it was there, not pretend it was this wonderful masculine sort of era. Central to going back into that history too is identifying the appropriation of Palestinian folk dances by Zionists. Now, an interesting thing that came out in the research as I was digging into this was going into the writings of early Zionist pioneers in the 1920s who talked about wanting to go to the villages, learning the dances, the local dances, and again, a romanticization of these dances, and they state very clearly these dances done by peasants must be the same ones that, and they've just been vessels carrying these dances for us for the last 2,000 years. These must be the same ones we used to dance 2,000 years ago. And they're in very clear documentation of how they went and gathered those and then reshaped them into Israeli national dances, which then went on to become very iconic and symbols of brand Israel around the world for over 50 years. But at the same time, how they were slowly written out of history. So these Zionist writings on the appropriation of Palestinian dance stop in the 1950s. By the 1960s, they're sort of eradicated. By the 1970s, we get the quotes of, oh yeah, Israeli folk dance, it just sort of came out of nowhere, it was a miracle. And how was that, how did that possibly happen? It must be, God wanted it. And yet we see very clearly, yes, there was this appropriation, it was documented, all these books were written about it that were then taken over to America and sold and distributed. Yeah, they still can't get it right. The soldier's, he's on the wrong leg there. But I won't go into that. Okay. Now, early on in this period, there were boycotts. And again, dance and the arts were a very central part of those boycotts. Here again, we have from an early British tourist in the region talking about how dance is being used as a community building form of developing solidarity, identifying the threat posed by Zionism, and part of the Arab Revolt, quite central to developing that spirit as it continues on to today. And we also see during that period that in hotels in Jerusalem and places of entertainment, there were boycotts going on there where they would refuse to have both bands that were supplied by the British or bands that were supplied by that were Zionists. And yet they would be bringing in bands and orchestras and groups that were from Spain, from elsewhere, from other locations, identifying there was this, cosmopolitan, pre-Israel state in which there was this desire to have interaction, globalization. This rejection of Zionism was not a rejection of the world, and the boycott was a very clear illustration of that. Which is very different to how it was then portrayed, particularly by the UN Special Council when I went to go through and just thought, well, no, there's all these backward peasants who don't want to have anything to do with the world, and then there's the Zionist community, which is really forward-thinking, so let's go with them. Now, following 1948, a period of pan-Arabism. We saw the Zionists appropriated the local folk dance. Then in the 1950s and 60s, pan-Arabists appropriated folk dances from all over the Arab world, circulated and redistributed them amongst each other as a means of consolidating that. There were dance teachers who came from Lebanon to teach Palestinians how to dance, and very much derided in their writings, they very much derided Palestinians, very grubby, messy, uncoordinated dance. So we'll give them a good Lebanese dubka and they'll get it right, and then and get them to perform it on stage in certain events to try to consolidate national identity. And still to this day, there's an unpacking of that influence within local Palestinian dances, and what were ours and what were the actual ones that were brought in as part of that period. Ramallah, especially, was also a very kind of as a mountainous region, was a highly cosmopolitan place. People came from all over the region there for the Ramallah Nights festivals and events, and because it was a Christian city, there was drinking, so that also underpinned a lot of the performance acts that came from all over the world, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, that would come and perform there in that region, alongside those that were kind of resurrecting the Pan-Arabists. Then, in 1967, following the 67 war, the very tight limitations that came around the West Bank in that period, there were forced closures by the Israeli military of these events, these festivals, and the Ramallah Nights events stopped taking place. At the same time, Palestinians were cut off from the rest of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, with whom they'd been having very deep connections for centuries, and families were isolated then, and culture was isolated. And we went into a period when there became a rising Palestinian nationalism and reappropriation again of Palestinian folk dances, this time as Palestinian national dance, but that's where again we started to see particularly women moved out of the picture as just supporting acts on the side of the men while they did the vigorous dubka in the middle. And yet that's been challenged much more recently and reintegrating. So no, actually our historic dance has had women front and central performing in very vibrant and vigorous ways. Now, by the time of the First Intifada, dance had become, a lot of that had been challenged. As we see, women were much more accepted on stage in the centre of performances. Palestinians in the West Bank were organising festivals that were local representations of culture, and dance had become a vehicle for political statements. At a time when every script of every play had to be reviewed by the Israeli authorities before it could be put on stage, dance performances go out, tell stories, often sort of romantic history stories, but stories of uprising and battle, was therefore being used as a performance form through groups like El-Funoun and Ramallah, who were gathering people. And through that then, Israeli authorities came and raided dance performances, arrested people on stage, arrested dancers, took them away. Pretty much every dancer I've worked with in Palestine, certainly every male dancer, by the time I'd arrived in 1998, had been arrested and been imprisoned and detained for sometimes up to 5 or 6 years through this process. But here we saw it as being very much a defiance. Now, what's interesting to note is in that period of the Jordanian rule, and then subsequently within Israeli rule, the notion of boycott didn't really come up amongst dancers because under Jordanians they were under the broader political boycotts that had non-relationships with the State of Israel, so it wasn't even an issue. And then also there was very little opportunity for any kind of international or any sort of exchange pre-Oslo. Now Oslo changed all that and started to present a whole new opening out to the world in terms of opportunities for Palestinians in the West Bank to have international collaborations and the fostering an expectation of collaborations between Palestinians and Israelis. And a lot of money was put into those sorts of collaborations, and there was a lot of resistance to that. And it led to a lot then of internal devising and division and uncertainty as well. Who can you dance with? When is it allowed? When is it not? Can we dance with any foreigner, or was that somehow facilitated by Israel? What are the expectations? And there were famous productions such as Romeo and Juliet, in which the Israelis were the Montagues, the Palestinians were the Capulets, and it was toured around the world as sponsored by the Israeli Ministry of Interior in, I think, 1996. as an attempt to try to convince the world of, look how wonderful we're getting on, again, that kind of smart washing. And Palestinians reacted very strongly against this, but then it meant those artists who'd been involved in that production were then blacklisted and not able to perform anymore within the occupied Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem. So there was a great confusion. And at the same time, there were Palestinians who were saying, look, we want to have legitimate exchanges with the world. We don't want to be in this isolated state where we only just keep dancing with each other. How do we do it? What are the expectations? And so that's where really the importance of the boycott movement came through, to really move us from passion to policy. And to identify when are we just backbiting and not wanting that person to dance with that person, and when is it clearly part of a very cohesive campaign that we all agree this is the reason why or not. So Palestinians were then, particularly in the 90s, Palestinian artists, dance groups, theatre groups, were very much at the forefront of debates and discussions within civil society as to how that may happen. Then, through PACBI, they became engaged with academics to extend that discussion and consolidate it. I think one of the unfortunate things, and look, I'm just going to bitch here for a second, because I'm an artist who's come into academia, and I know how diminished artists become when they come into this space. I bet you, so many of you looked at me on the conference program and said, a dancer? Really? Let's see what's on the other, what's over there? Oh, something worse. Okay, I'll have to stay here. So there is an expectation, what could this person possibly have insights for? And that is still a predominant ideal within Palestine as well. And it's very hard to be maintained, and part of that is because very little academic work has focused on the arts. And that which has focused on the arts has focused on it purely in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is deeply problematic. I've written heaps about it. I'm really proud. I can't stand here because I'm not just writing about it because of the conflict. I'm writing about it because they're doing really interesting things, artistically, creatively. They're looking at how do we collaborate creatively. They have lessons for the world on that aren't simply framed within. But where are our books on the histories of theatre and music and fine arts and such in Palestine? It's very diminished. And so I'm going to come back to that a bit later, but it is a charge. If we are going to be here as academics, very committed to wanting to shift the discourse and shift it, we can also be very proactive. And how do we establish partnerships with artists, with academics in the West Bank, in Palestine, in bringing this out and providing more complex images of the region? During this period, dance shifted from being simply a performance of the national past, but to very much a performance of national prophecy. This is what Palestine could be. The idea of sumud was emphasised, that this steadfast resistance. We will stay here, we will keep dancing, and this is who we're going to be in the future. And it shifted simply from dressing up in torbs and trying to decide whether that was the right Dubka step or this was the right Dubka step from archaic times, saying, what do we want to do now, and how do we want to express ourselves, and how can we move into use movement as a way that isn't simply imitating how the West used the creative moving body, but still talks to us. Because as we saw, and as I showed you from the earlier images, the creative moving body was very central to discourses in Palestine historically. The community consolidation, the ways of interacting. And again, as academics, we can tend to just reduce everything down to the importance of words, and if it's not in words, it's not really meaningful. But to say, actually, no, how people communicate through this other form can be just as valid and be just as important in sustaining within a community, and a way of imagining how a community may be in the future. Now, within that, then the PACBI campaign helped consolidate and clarify, well, what is it we're actually boycotting? It's Israeli cultural institutions, products, cultural events, normalization projects, and Israeli-funded research and study tools. Now, it's interesting the evolution of this, and this is now a zone that I'm going into to research further, as what were the discussions that happened behind closed doors? How did we get to this point that this was there? Because clearly a lot of people would have been miffed that not on this list were issues of Israelis, because that would have been a predominant thing. Oh, we just can't perform. But if they're Israeli, if they hold Israeli citizenship, that were certainly reasons why they would not have accepted performing with them in the past, simply on that, regardless of these other issues. And yet, it was seen, and probably to extend the understanding to the international community, that we're not against those individuals. However, I wouldn't say that insidiously, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'll extend on those reasons later. But insidiously, the idea of actually performing with someone who holds Israeli citizenship remains a point of boycott. Those collaborations don't happen because pretty much also within all of that, this would have to happen. There have been people who've come and worked who've had formerly Israeli citizenship and used another national identity to come and say, oh no, actually I'm from Germany, and do some workshops, and then go away and write about it in Israeli journals about what they did, and that certainly made people very suspicious of being able to engage in that sort of interaction. And fundamentally, though, it comes down to the idea that, well, I can't really dance with you at the moment if next week you're going to be at the checkpoint holding a gun, not letting me through. And it's not simply a theoretical idea that your identity exists and my identity exists. It's a very physical thing, real thing, that you will be serving in the Israeli military unless you state that you're going to be a refugee. And I'm going to have to face you in some form, even if it's that you're the one pressing the computer button far away in Tel Aviv, identifying that no, that person can't come through. I'm still going to be oppressed by them. So it leaves that as a vague thing, but at least very clearly it was identified, well, these are the ones that we all collectively, internally agree we will not have anything to do with. And all of this local arts organisations and civil society signed up for that. Yes, this then moved to looking at 3 goals. And I think this is where I really love what Hassan was talking about earlier today about the alter, because everything within the BDS writing has really been on the anti. It's been about identifying, as Omar Barghouti notes, this is a rights-focused movement, not a solutions-focused movement. But inevitably, it is implicitly suggesting a solution, which is that a multicultural society, a multi-ethnic society in which diverse people are tolerated and accepted, because you can't have the return of refugees without that. It's inevitably a challenge to the two-state solution. And I think the absence of that alter is problematic for academics and others, artists around the world, because they don't know what they're signing up to. And as academics, like anyone, hate being told what they can't do, but they quite like knowing, oh, this is a path you can do, or what you can do over here. This is the alternate vision that we're looking towards, as in South Africa, a nation of all its people. But if that's not being articulated, it's very unclear, well, what is the end game here? Yeah, so we had Israel reacting to that, called for the boycott, as has been alluded to yesterday, the calls for civil targeted killing of BDS activists, though not in those terms, the civil eliminations, and the Israeli travel ban that came down earlier this year in the Knesset saying anyone who calls for a boycott is not allowed into the country. It's like, we don't want to go into the country, we just want to get to Ramallah. You're the one holding the border. But that's not how it appears to the international community to us. Like, well, of course they shouldn't be allowed in if they're going to call a boycott. So I'm going to come back to 3 questions basically now, just to conclude the speech. And these are kind of queries that have come from the work I've been doing, but also just a lot of the discussion that's come up here over the last couple of days. One is this idea of looking at policy. When national governance structure, don't you love these two? Don't you want to just put the hands of the future in these two to work out for you in terms of I've got faith now, it's all going to work out. I wonder what he's laughing at. But yeah, when national governance structures fail to provide equitable, just and democratic leadership, and I think we can say that about the Palestinian Authority in terms of their response to the BDS and their failure to support it and their continued desire to simply maintain and survive themselves and not recognise the demands that have come from civil society that have been so broadly stated across civil society demanding this, that the Palestinian Authority has to be held accountable for this. So when that happens, how can art connect with academia and civil society to respond in a principled and consistent way? This is an area deserving of research. We need to understand, how have artists and academics come together? How can we foster and sustain that, both in Palestine, but how is that a lesson for the rest of the world? For other places that are seeking to change and shift things. And they've done such a wonderful model there, probably with a lot of conflicts and contestations. It'd be nice to unpack. But this certainly is an area for focus. My second concern, and it builds on what I was asking Hassan and Jake yesterday about, in this corporatized university world, in our shift from the civic university to the corporate university, are we simply supporting that shift when we make our focus of a boycott on these very tangible performances of boycott, which are about showing, oh, I won't exchange, I won't do that, which is great. Yes, I'm not doubting the validity of them. But at the same time, does that go to the heart of what an academic can actually do in terms of either advancing, promoting other voices or challenging other voices as an academic? And where might that lead us to in terms of, if we're looking at an academic and a cultural boycott, where further might our responsibilities extend? And for artists, if the civil rights sought by BDS inevitably demand a more equitable, multi-ethnic society, integrating comparable populations of Indigenous and migrant populations, if that's where we're seeing it's a post-binational prophecy, how can artists present clear alternate visions to an inclusive, tolerant and diverse future society? This is quite important because I was just, a couple of weeks ago I was in Ramallah. I was having an argument with my niece who's 18 and knows absolutely everything about the world, as all 18-year-olds do, and we were arguing about, well, okay, what's the future? She was about to start a BSA at university. She's with the PFLP, which is the tribe my family belongs to. So I mentioned earlier, whilst I was living in Palestine, I got married to a Palestinian. That's kind of why I was there. Let's not pretend it was political. And had lovely children, and we've since moved to New Zealand. If we are going to be looking at the future society, we do want to support something like the BDS. What is then the responsibility of artists to show and reimagine what that future will be once that has been achieved? How do we have to shift from some of the national rhetoric? Now, my niece was giving me the wonderful PFLP slogans about, from the river to the sea, and it's all going to be ours again, and all this, and they're going to be gone, and they're all just going to leave us. Like, yeah, well, that's one, it's really vain, because it's easy to perform that idea without knowing it's never going to happen, and you're not going to have to take the consequences for it, but you can look really righteous while you're doing it. And two, it's not necessarily something I want to support. I'm really not here to. And I think, most people around the world, as was mentioned earlier, are not there wanting to see a completely decolonisation, as Ghassan was saying. That means a destruction or a killing of the colonisers, and we want to move away from that. But we do need this alter, as Ghassan was suggesting. We need this, and we need it to be manifested in art, and that's as important as the BDS actions, in order for people to see, well, that's where BDS is heading towards. So those are my questions. How can artists do this? And I'm just going to leave with a little creative provocation, because I think, the great thing about current governance is it's provided such great opportunities for satire. And, Melania gave it. If she can do it, we can all do it. If you do some movement, some gesture, I want to see if I can get this to go viral as a dance around the world. It just says, fuck off, Trump. And fuck off, Donald, and let it become a movement. This is a way also of consolidating. It's within these movements that perhaps articulate ideas that we don't capture so well, always in words that we're very suspicious of, and we get polarised by. Movement has a very central part to play in that future struggle. Thank you.
We have one more presentation on this Indigenous and arts-based solidarity panel. Now, this is going to be a paper by Victoria Grieves, Dr. Victoria Grieves. She's presently in Canada, and so we're very happy and fortunate today to have Milo Mawada to present her paper.
Yeah, my name's Willow Mawada, and I'm a Calgaroon man from northwestern Queensland, that's Mount Isa area, and my mother's a Eastern Arrernte Aleut from Central Desert, between Alice Springs and Urandangi. My niece was supposed to do this. She's doing her MPhil here at the uni. She's got stuff to do, and Vicky's her supervisor. And I'm with health sciences, so I'm a little bit different from this perspective. But however, I've worked with HIV. I sit on a International Indigenous HIV committee, a board in Canada. I just came back from Canada and do research around HIV with Indigenous communities globally. And we extend that to stuff like hepatitis C and TB as well, other co-infections, malaria. I've worked in Papua New Guinea, worked in Queensland using whole of community approaches. So I understand where Vicky's coming from with a lot of this. My interest in health is around ethics. I call it black tracking, My name Muwara is my great-grandfather's name, and he's a lawman, and we track stuff. We observe and we track things. And it's in behaviours, it's everywhere. It's in design. You can track stuff back, and it goes back to the old spirit, the one spirit that sits in all of us. And there's a law and there's protocols around that as human beings. That's what we believe as Indigenous people. We are all got the same spirit. So I've read Vicky's paper, so I'll start it for you. In October 2016, the Queensland-based Aboriginal artist Richard Bell took his installation Aboriginal Embassy to Jerusalem for display in the Kalandia International. Bell's installation pays homage to the Aboriginal tent embassy set up on the front lawns of Parliament House in Canberra in 1972, more than 40 years ago. The tent embassy is a powerful motive as it demonstrates how activist Aboriginal people understood that they were located outside of the Australian state. So much so that they had to have an embassy to have the government recognise and speak to them as the original peoples. Bell took this idea of a separate existence of marginalised people in Western democracies to Palestine. He designed the installation to be a place of discussion of the ongoing issues affecting Aboriginal people. The local press in Jerusalem reported that sitting inside the plain-looking tent, its sides raised to allow an audience to look in, and with a sign in Arabic at its front, Bell, a striking figure, spoke passionately about how his people have been oppressed, displaced, uprooted, impoverished, and alienated in their own homeland. Colonial forces create divisions wherever and whenever they can, Bell said. He tied in the Aboriginal struggle for recognition of their rights and mere existence with that of the Palestinian struggle to regain their rights and land. For both the Aboriginals and the Palestinians, he said, the loss of land is an integral part of the struggle. Next to the tent embassy was a sign in Arabic which read, "White invaders, you are living on stolen land." The local relevance was not lost on visitors. Just replace the word white with Zionist, said a member of the audience during an informal question and answer session after Bell's talk, and this is our situation. Speaking for Vicky now. As for me, my heart has and continues to bleed for the people of Palestine. Over the decades of my life, as the many facets of their oppression have rolled on, I've understood them as rightful custodians of their lands who are bearing the brunt of a modern-day colonialist, genocidal takeover with the tacit acceptance and approval of the major powers of the world. This has taught me that the days of colonialism are far from over. But like the cunning evil that it is, colonialism, as with fascism, shifts and changes shape. It is slippery and often hard to pin down. While the modern settler colonial state of Australia would have us believe that the horrors of colonialism are past, reflecting on the situation in Palestine has encouraged me to look at the oppression of my own people in a different way. In the case of Indigenous peoples, such as the Palestinians and Aboriginal Australians, the impacts are more profound than if they were actually included within the state as citizens. I say this because there are, as we know, disadvantaged and oppressed citizens within nation states. This can include people with ethnic minority groups as well as people of gender difference, of various physical and psychological abilities, and lower socio-economic groups. What is important is to distinguish the structural nature of the oppression in order to understand the far-reaching consequences and impacts. It is my contention that Aboriginal people and Palestinians have a common relationship to the democratic nation states that have come to envelop them, in that they are increasingly in states of exception to modern democratic states where the structural relationships are nihilistic. There is a layered historical, economic, political and social complexity over all examples of modern-day oppression of Indigenous peoples, but important patterns and indicators can be discerned. For example, Various theoretical models have been used to describe the oppression of the Palestinian people: colonialism, neo-colonialism, religious persecution, racism, genocide, apartheid, and war. All of these are equally applicable to Aboriginal people, but there's more than this that connects us. Others have taken this critical analysis further through the existing structural relations to nation states and theorise Palestinian people as being in a state of exception to the modern democratic state. This is a state of being such as only bare life is possible, and it is a concept out of the 20th century experience of wars and displacements, an important theoretical development from the philosopher Giorgio Agamben. I believe that this too explains the nature of oppression of Aboriginal people, and I have more fully argued this in a chapter in a collection about the Northern Territory Emergency Response, also known as the Intervention. The 7 pillars of Aboriginal exception to the Australian state, and you will find it on Vicky's academia profile. I was inspired by Giorgio Agamben's book Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life in 1998, in which he seeks to examine the hidden connections between something more than totalitarianism and modern democracies. Agamben has defined the state of exception to the modern democratic state as a conceptual and legal space where the advantages of citizenship, including human rights, are not present and, more than this, those in the state of exception receive the violence of the modern democratic state. He says that Homo Sacer has only bare life. What is this? As Ziarik argues, stripped from political significance and exposed to murderous violence, bare life is both the counterpart of the sovereign decision on the state of exception and the target of sovereign violence. This biopolitics see violence vested in many forms: social, political, economic, and not always geographic exclusions. Denial of citizenship rights, including public health facilities and other services, refusing to treat people, to really hear their voices, the homogenisation and stereotyping of people, the development of policies for them as a separate group, and actual physical violence wielded upon the bodies of people by the citizens or agents of the sovereign state. Agamben has theorised the state of exception as the fundamental political structure of our age. The sovereign state seizes hold of life for itself by making an exception. There are strong parallels with the act of colonisation, but it is in the aftermath of colonisation that this state of exception is cemented in. His theory assisted me to more fully understand the relationship of Aboriginal people to the settler colonial state. All of the indicators listed in the paragraph above apply to Aboriginal people. In fact, the recent revelations of the outrageous violent mistreatment of Aboriginal juveniles in detention, as initially evidenced by film footage from the Dondale Correctional Centre in the Northern Territory, add much weight to the argument that Aboriginal people exist in a state of exception to the Australian settler colonial state. Agamben asserts that the entirety of human rights is vested in the citizen as the fundamental unit of the modern democratic state in which the democratic representatives, the lawgivers, are sovereign. The paradox of sovereignty is that its own law cannot manage the sovereign. The sovereign is simultaneously within and outside of the law and defines the sphere of the law's validity by deciding what can be lawfully cast beyond it. By this means, the sovereign state inscribes within the body of the law an exteriority that animates it and gives it meaning. This exteriority is life itself. For life itself, what Agamben calls bare life, is what can be killed by the sovereign state. Without the impact of the law, that would define it as murder. Witness the death of Elijah Doherty and so many others, and the failure of the Australian legal system to bring his murderer and other murderers of Aboriginal people to justice. People who exist in the state of exception have bare life, in that they have nothing but life. To me, this idea of homosesa represents people with no housing, no assets, no capital, no possessions to speak of, very little to sustain their bodies. They often lose a sense of family and connection to the world. They are forced to exist day to day or even hour to hour, holding on to bare life. Further, Agamben argues that citizens of modern democratic nation states cannot be citizens with all the rights that this entails, without the exception, without homosesa. It is the bare life of those in the state of exception that makes the lives of the citizen possible. Citizens have rights only because those in the state of exception have no rights. Homosesa has no citizenship rights, no human rights, as the law is suspended in this external sphere. Since the modern democratic state is predicated on the rights of the citizen, the sovereign includes its exception in the form of an exclusion, which belongs without belonging. This inclusive exclusion is what allows a state to include an exception, which is de facto excluded. Agamben says that law in its originary state is only law through what it managed to capture inside itself through the inclusive exclusion of the exception. It nourishes itself on this exception and is a dead letter without it. The idea of Aboriginal people belonging to the settler-colonial state without belonging to terms of citizenship is salient to very many otherwise inexplicable moments in our relationship with the state, the cunning of citizenship. Agamben came by this theory of the state of exception by a critical analysis of the camps that began to grow in Europe following the First World War. He observes that camps are places where people go to die. One only has to think of the public health implications of living in camps to understand that this is the case, and then there is the lack of hope. The camps of the refugees in Europe, like the camps of Aboriginal people who are made refugees in their own country, and the camps of the Central American forced migrants, also refugees, along the train lines of Mexico, the refugee camps throughout Asia, and the Australian government camp for refugees on Manus Island are places of bare life. So too are the camps that Palestinian refugees in their own country have to build in order to cling to life. The people in camps can only live on a day-to-day or an hour-to-hour basis. For as long as they do live, they can have little hope for the future. Agamben sees the touchstone of human rights and social justice in how political organisations around the globe treat refugees. The correct question to pose concerning the horrors committed in the camps is, therefore, not how crimes of such atrocity could be committed, but how judicial procedures and deployments of power can exist by which human beings could be so completely deprived of their rights and prerogatives that no act committed against them could appear any longer as a crime. Again, the death of Elijah Doherty and the subsequent inexplicable judicial ruling following is salient here, as are the thousands of dead and refugee Palestinians. Moreover, it can be argued that the position of Aboriginal people who have experienced and endured the Northern Territory emergency response initiated in 2007, and it has had impacts nationwide, is extremely close to that of the Palestinian people. Both groups are now excluded from citizenship to such an extent that they are in an undeclared war. While Agamben does not explicitly say this, living in a war zone is what the state of exception is about. As a victim of war, you have only bare life to sustain you. Through the contemporary complexities of various stages and manifestations of colonialism, decolonisation and neo-colonialism, and the oppression of race-based settler colonial regimes, Aboriginal people and the people of Palestine are deeply connected through being in a state of exception to the modern democratic states that oppress them. It is the living out of bare life in forced locations antithetical to human life. The camps of occupied territories of no man's lands, the town camps, fringe camps, camps on remote homelands, that irreparably joins us in struggle. It is the existential reduction of human life in no man's land and in the inexorable terra nullius of the settler colonial state that underlines the global reach and connectedness of the struggle of diverse peoples for their sovereignty and freedom. The thread of undying struggle stretches around the world and connects us, Aboriginal people, to the people of Palestine. Thank you, Dr. Vicky Grieves.